Once upon a time in a vibrant village, a young woman named Amina found herself in a dire situation. Her father insisted she marry a wealthy, deaf-mute man named Kwame, and on the night of their wedding, the tension was palpable. "Amina, you will marry Kwame," her father's voice boomed, echoing through the grand hall of their ancestral home. Amina sat frozen, her heart racing as she faced her father, surrounded by ancestral portraits that seemed to judge her for resisting his wishes. "No, father!" she exclaimed, panic in her eyes. "I cannot marry someone I do not love." Her father, a stern man with graying hair, crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. "This is not your decision to make," he declared, his voice deep and authoritative. "Our family needs this union to secure our status. Kwame is wealthy, and his family has powerful connections. You are my daughter. You must fulfill your duty." "Duty?" Amina scoffed bitterly. "Is my duty to be a pawn in your game?" Just then, her stepmother Zuri entered, her expression smug as she adjusted her elegant red dress. "Amina, stop being so stubborn," she said sweetly yet mockingly. "Your father is doing this for your own good. You should feel fortunate to marry someone like Kwame." Amina's fury ignited. "A marriage where the bride has no say is not luck." Zuri shrugged, a taunting smile on her lips. "At least you'll live a life of luxury. Isn't that what every woman dreams of?" Amina clenched her fists, disbelief washing over her. The father she once respected was treating her like a mere object. "Father, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Let me choose who I love. I promise I won't disappoint you." Her father sighed, impatience evident. "The decision is final," he stated firmly. "The wedding will take place next week." Amina felt her heart break. She couldn't recall how she left the living room, but soon she found herself locked in her bedroom, the heavy door bolted from the outside. "Father, you can't do this to me!" She banged on the door, screaming, but silence met her cries. Outside, she heard the voice of Juma, one of her father's loyal guards, relaying her father's orders. "The young lady is not to leave her room." Anger surged within her. She was imprisoned in her own home. The lavish decor of her room felt suffocating, the silk curtains and plush blankets, now a gilded cage. She tried to open the window, but iron bars crushed her hopes of escape. Defeated, she collapsed onto her bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. 3 days later, her father entered her room, placing a stack of documents on the table. "Sign it," he ordered. Amina lifted her head, her eyes swollen from crying. "What am I signing?" "The marriage certificate," he replied. Her heart clenched painfully as she looked at the papers, her name and Kwame's already printed. With one signature, her life would be bound to a man she had never met. "No," she whispered, her voice frail but resolute. Her father's brows furrowed, but he remained calm. He gestured to the door, and 2 men entered, Juma and another guard. "Amina," her father said slowly, "I don't want to use force against you, but you know I always get what I want." The guards approached, their eyes cold and unyielding. "Fine," she screamed. "I'll sign it." Her father nodded in satisfaction, handing her a pen. Her hands trembled as she lowered the pen to the paper, biting her lip until it bled. The first stroke of ink fell, her signature sealing her fate. Her father inspected the document, nodding. "Very good. The wedding will take place tomorrow. You will be Kwame's wife." With that, he left, and Amina sat frozen, staring at her trembling hands. Had this really happened? Had she truly been forced to marry a man she knew nothing about? She buried her face in her palms, feeling as if her world had collapsed. Starting tomorrow, she would no longer be Amina. She would be Kwame's wife, a bird trapped in a gilded cage forever. The church bells tolled mournfully, each chime echoing through the village square. Amina stood before the large mirror in the dressing room, staring at her reflection, a bride in a dazzling white gown. Yet her eyes were empty and lifeless. Fatima, one of the family's longtime maids, trembled as she fastened Amina's veil. "My lady, are you all right?" she asked softly, as if afraid a single wrong word would shatter the heavy silence. Amina didn't answer. She only clenched her trembling hands tighter. She was far from all right. Outside, guests had gathered, chattering excitedly about what was supposed to be the grandest wedding of the year. But to Amina, it felt like a public execution. A knock on the door startled her. "Amina, come out, it's time," her father called. She cast a fleeting glance at Fatima, hoping the old maid could help her escape this nightmare. But the helpless look in Fatima's eyes told her the truth. No one could save her now. Taking a deep breath, she swallowed her tears and stepped out. Her father took her arm with an air of authority, and beside him, Zuri wore a satisfied smile, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "My daughter looks stunning," he murmured, though there was no affection in his voice. Amina pressed her lips together, refusing to respond. She saw Zuri lean in toward her father, smirking. "Let's just hope she doesn't embarrass the family during the ceremony." Amina heard every word, but she no longer had the strength to fight back. The church doors swung open, and music filled the air, blending with the murmurs of the crowd. All eyes turned toward her, and she could hear the hushed whispers from both sides. What a shame for that poor girl. A forced marriage. How pitiful. Each word felt like a blade slicing into her heart. Up at the altar, standing beside the priest, was Kwame. He wore a sleek black suit, his hair neatly combed. But what stunned Amina was his gaze, deep, sorrowful, devoid of any joy for this marriage. A thought flickered through her mind. Could it be that he didn't want this marriage either? But the thought was quickly swallowed by bitter reality. Whether he wanted it or not, they were bound to each other forever. Her father tightened his grip on her arm, pulling her forward as the priest began the ceremony, his voice solemn as he recited the familiar vows. Amina heard nothing. Her mind was blank. Then came the most crucial moment. The priest turned to her and asked, "Amina, do you take Kwame to be your husband?" She felt her breath catch. No, she didn't want this. But her father's icy stare reminded her that she had no choice. Closing her eyes, she felt as if she were stepping off a cliff into the abyss. "I do." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests smirked mockingly, while others looked at her with pity. The priest then turned to Kwame. Of course, he couldn't say, "I do." Instead, he gave a small nod, cold and resolute. The wedding ring slid onto her finger, its weight heavy and suffocating, like a shackle tightening around her life. The wedding reception was held at the Grand Pavilion, more lavish and extravagant than any event Amina had ever attended. But to her, it was nothing more than a stage performance, an illusion of celebration. Zuri beamed with pride, parading around the room, boasting about the successful marriage of the family. Her father mingled with businessmen, discussing lucrative deals that would soon be sealed, while Amina was surrounded by curious gazes and mocking whispers. "Congratulations, Amina," said an old friend, raising his glass of palm wine. "I never expected you to choose such an unconventional marriage." Amina looked at him, feeling a bitter lump in her throat. She didn't choose. She never had a choice. "You're so lucky." Another woman chimed in with a sugary, sweet smile. "Your husband will never talk back to you." Laughter erupted around them, and Amina's face burned with humiliation. She searched the room for Kwame. He stood in a corner, observing the scene in silence, as if he didn't exist. She had no idea what he was thinking. Perhaps he was used to isolation. As for her, she was only beginning to experience it. Zuri drifted closer, pulling Amina into a faint embrace, but instead of comforting her, she whispered in her ear, "Get used to this, darling. Your life will only get worse from here." Amina stiffened, hot tears welling in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Tonight, when the reception ended, she would officially belong to Kwame. She had no idea what awaited her in that unfamiliar mansion. All she knew was that this was the beginning of hell. The luxurious car rolled away from the hotel, carrying Amina to the place she would now have to call home. She sat upright, her hands clasped tightly together, while Kwame sat beside her, silent and unmoving like a statue. The dim interior of the car was illuminated only by the flickering streetlights outside. The silence between them was suffocating, making each passing second feel heavier. Amina didn't know what to do or what to say. She stole a glance at Kwame. His face was expressionless, his deep, quiet eyes fixed straight ahead. Did he feel anything? Did he have any thoughts about this marriage? Or was it just another business transaction to him? She had no answers. Finally, the car pulled up in front of a massive mansion on the outskirts of the village. The heavy iron gates creaked open, revealing a vast estate surrounded by towering trees. Juma, the old butler, was already waiting at the entrance. He bowed slightly as they stepped out of the car. "Welcome home, sir and madam." Amina flinched at the word, madam. It felt so foreign. She wasn't anyone's madam. Juma gestured for her to enter, and Kwame stepped inside first without a word. The mansion's classic architecture was adorned with glittering chandeliers, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors. But despite its grandeur, the air was cold and eerily lifeless. A shiver ran down Amina's spine. This wasn't a home, it was a prison. Juma led her up a grand staircase to a large set of double doors. "This is your shared bedroom," he said in a low, grave voice before swiftly excusing himself, leaving her alone with Kwame. Amina stood frozen in front of the door, unwilling to step inside. She had never shared a room with a man before. Now she was expected to share her life with a stranger. Kwame pushed the door open and walked in without hesitation. She hesitated for a few seconds, then reluctantly followed. The bedroom was spacious, its furnishings luxurious. A massive bed with crisp white sheets sat in the center of the room. The dark-toned paintings on the walls only added to the somber atmosphere. Amina felt her breath quicken. Would she have to sleep beside him tonight? She clutched the thin shawl around her shoulders, trying to suppress the fear creeping up her spine. Kwame stood near the window, his back to her. The tension in the air was unbearable. She swallowed hard and finally broke the silence. "Where do you want me to sleep?" Kwame turned around, gazing at her for a long moment before leaving the window and walking toward the wardrobe. He opened it, took out a set of nightwear, and went straight into the bathroom without saying a single word. Amina stood there feeling awkward and confused. Why didn't he answer? Why was he always so silent? The sound of running water echoed from the bathroom, and Amina felt her nerves stretched to their limit. Determined to get ready before Kwame came out, she opened her suitcase, took out a simple silk nightgown, and quickly changed. She sat on the bed, her heart pounding wildly. The bathroom door opened, and Kwame stepped out, his hair slightly damp, dressed in a dark-colored pajama shirt. Without a glance at her, he walked over to the desk, sat down and opened a notebook. He wasn't coming to bed. Amina bit her lip, unsure whether she should feel relieved or even more anxious. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her courage. "You?" Kwame stiffened but didn't turn his head. Amina stared at him, so many questions swirling in her mind. Why had he agreed to this marriage? What did he think of her? Why did he always keep silent? But the words remained stuck in her throat. She sighed and turned back toward the bed. "Don't be afraid." A deep, clear voice broke the silence. She froze, every hair on the back of her neck standing on end. That voice, she whipped around. Kwame was still sitting in his chair, but this time his gaze was locked directly onto hers. No way, he had spoken, but he was supposed to be mute. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She didn't trust her own ears anymore. Instinctively, she took a step back. "You just spoke!" Her voice trembled. Kwame remained expressionless, a terrifying silence filling the room. Amina felt her breath growing heavier. He wasn't mute. Everything she had been told, all the rumors, all the things her father had led her to believe, had been a lie. She shook her head, feeling her world spinning. Kwame tilted his head slightly, his deep eyes never leaving hers. "Amina!" She froze. He had just said her name. His voice was low and warm, yet to her it felt like a blade cutting through her mind. She took another shaky breath and stepped back, but her back hit the edge of the bed. "You!" Before she could finish her question, Kwame stood up and started walking toward her. Each step made her heartbeat grow wilder. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She stared at the man before her, her whole body trembling. And for the first time since this marriage began, she was truly afraid. Amina felt paralyzed as Kwame stopped right in front of her. Her heart pounded erratically, and a cold sweat ran down her spine. He was never mute. Everything she had believed, everything her father had told her about Kwame, was a lie. She swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "Why? Why did you lie to me?" Kwame didn't answer right away. He simply continued to look at her with an unreadable expression, as if debating whether he should speak or not. Amina clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. She couldn't let herself be swallowed by this oppressive silence. "Answer me," she demanded, her voice rising with tension. There was information about her, her name, her birth date, every detail of her life. Her fingers shook as she clutched the papers. Who was Kwame really? Why did he marry her? Was this marriage merely a business transaction, or was there something far more sinister at play? Amina hurriedly closed the file, her heart pounding. She placed the documents back on the desk, trying to leave everything exactly as she found it. Why did Kwame have such detailed records on her and her family? What was this marriage really about? She backed out of the study, struggling to steady her breath. Whatever Kwame was hiding, it was far more complicated than she had initially thought. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out. For the rest of the day, Amina discreetly examined every part of the mansion. The house was massive, yet it felt like a beautifully designed cage. She discovered that while the front doors were always open, there were guards stationed outside at all times. The main gate leading to the road was locked with an advanced security system. Amina decided to try another route. She walked around to the back of the estate, where a vast garden stretched out before her. She moved past the rows of neatly trimmed trees, searching for a possible escape route. But just as she neared the outer fence, a voice called out from behind her. "Madam, do you need any assistance?" Amina's heart jumped in her chest. She turned around to face Juma, one of Kwame's personal bodyguards. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp, unreadable features. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "I was just taking a walk," she said, trying to sound casual. Juma didn't take his eyes off her. "Amina, I advise you not to stray too far," he said, his voice low, carrying an unmistakable warning. "This place is not easy to escape from." She froze, he knew. They all knew. They were watching her. She wasn't a wife. She was a prisoner. That afternoon, she was sitting by her bedroom window when she heard the sound of a car stopping at the front gate. Moments later, the sharp click of high heels echoed against the marble floor. Amina didn't need to look to know who had arrived. She stood up, crossed her arms over her chest, and braced herself for the uninvited guest. The door swung open, and Zuri stepped inside, her deep red lips curling into a knowing smile. "It's good to see you adjusting to your new life," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. Amina clenched her fists. "What are you doing here?" Zuri shrugged, glancing around the room with faint curiosity. "Just visiting. I wanted to see how married life is treating you." Amina scoffed. "Do you really care about me, or are you just here to make sure I'm still locked inside this cage?" Zuri laughed softly. "Amina, you always think the worst." She stepped closer, placing a hand on Amina's shoulder as if to comfort her. "I just came to remind you this marriage is your fate. You should accept it." Amina shoved her hand away. "I don't believe in fate," she said coldly, "and I won't let anyone control my life." Zuri tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Is that so? Then I'll be very curious to see what you do next." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Amina seething with anger. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to find a way out. That night, Amina waited until the house had fallen silent. She carefully opened her bedroom door and slipped into the hallway. The mansion was enormous, but after days of wandering its halls, she had memorized a few routes that might lead her outside. She moved quietly down the grand staircase, staying in the shadows. She could hear the guards' footsteps as they patrolled. Holding her breath, she waited for them to pass, then quickly made her way down to the ground floor. The side door leading to the garden was just ahead. She tiptoed forward and slowly reached for the handle. "Where do you think you're going?" A deep voice sounded behind her, freezing her in place. She spun around. Juma stood there, his hands in his pockets, his sharp eyes fixed on her. Amina bit her lip. "I just wanted to get some fresh air." Juma didn't reply right away. He simply watched her. Then after a long pause, he shook his head. "Madam, I think it's best if you go back to your room." Amina clenched her fists. She wanted to fight back, but she knew she had no chance. Helpless, she turned and walked back upstairs in silence. As the door closed behind her, she felt like her world was growing smaller and smaller. There was no way out. The next day, Amina didn't leave her room. She felt trapped, backed into a corner. She couldn't trust anyone. She couldn't ask for help. She had tried to escape, but Kwame had made sure she was locked inside this house, and now she was starting to lose herself. She was once strong. Now she was just a wife forced into a marriage she had no control over. That evening, when Kwame returned to the mansion, she decided to confront him. She waited until he entered his study, then followed him inside. The door shut behind them. Kwame sat down, loosened his tie, and looked at her with a calm expression. Amina, what do you want? She strode forward, pressing both hands on his desk, locking eyes with him. Why are you keeping me here? Kwame raised an eyebrow. I'm not keeping you here. Don't lie to me, she shouted. You have guards watching me. You won't let me leave this mansion. Kwame sighed, leaning back in his chair. Amina, you don't understand. Then explain it to me. For the first time, Kwame fell into a long silence. She waited, wanting an answer, but all he said was, It's not time yet. Amina's hands curled into fists. She felt like she was going insane. If Kwame wouldn't give her the truth, she would find it herself. Amina felt surrounded on all sides. She couldn't leave the mansion. The guards monitored her every move. Kwame refused to tell her anything. She had no choice but to find the truth on her own. That night, Amina decided to follow Kwame. She waited until the mansion was completely silent. When she was certain no one was paying attention, she slipped out of her room and crept down the staircase. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the tall windows. She moved cautiously along the hallway, careful not to make a sound. Then suddenly she heard footsteps. Amina quickly pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. Kwame emerged from the far end of the corridor. He wasn't dressed in his usual tailored suit. Instead, he wore a simple black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking far more relaxed than usual. But it wasn't his clothes that stunned her. It was the fact that he was talking to someone. His voice was deep, clear, and steady. Amina felt a cold chill run down her spine. She leaned in closer, straining to listen. Kwame stood in front of a small office door, speaking with Juma, the mansion's old butler. Amina is starting to suspect something, Kwame said, his voice low but serious. Juma nodded slightly. The girl is intelligent. She won't stop until she finds the truth. Amina covered her mouth, trying to quiet her rapid breathing. They were talking about her. Kwame sighed, rubbing his temples. You know I didn't want it to come to this, but I had no choice. Juma remained silent for a moment before asking, Are you going to tell her? Kwame shook his head. Not yet. Amina clenched her fists. Not yet? How long was he planning to keep lying to her? After Kwame left, she waited a few more minutes before stepping toward the door where he and Juma had just been standing. It wasn't locked. She hesitated, then slowly pushed it open and slipped inside. The room was smaller than she expected, but it was far from simple. Old bookshelves lined the walls, filled with aged volumes. The large wooden desk in the center was covered with documents and files, and right in the middle of the desk was a framed photograph. Amina's heartbeat pounded in her chest. She picked up the photo. It was a family portrait. Kwame, as a child, stood next to an older man with a stern expression. His father, perhaps. But what shocked her was the woman standing beside Kwame. She looked eerily similar to Amina. Amina's breath caught. Who was this woman? Why did she look so much like her? She quickly shuffled through the papers on the desk, then her eyes landed on a file labeled Confidential, Vasquez Family. Amina flipped it open, her hands trembling. Her breath hitched when she reached a specific section. Incident of 1998, the assassination of Mrs. Isabel Vasquez, mother of Kwame Vasquez. Mrs. Isabel was murdered in a planned attack linked to the Montgomery family. Amina froze. Montgomery, her family's name. She kept reading, her heart hammering against her ribs. Initial evidence suggests Richard Montgomery was involved in the incident. Amina dropped the file, her hands shaking. Her father was involved in Kwame's mother's murder. Was this why Kwame married her? For revenge? The room suddenly felt like it was spinning. She stumbled backward, bumping into a bookshelf, causing a book to fall to the floor with a loud thud. The sound echoed in the silence. She barely had time to react before she heard footsteps approaching. Amina's blood ran cold. The door swung open, and Kwame stood there, his eyes darkening the moment he saw her. Amina instinctively took a step back, but the intensity in his gaze held her frozen in place. What are you doing here? His voice was low, dangerous. She swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. I'm looking for the truth. He stared at her for a long moment before stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. Now they were alone. There was no escape. Amina met his gaze, determined to get answers. "You've been lying to me since the beginning, haven't you?" she demanded. "You're not mute. And now I find out you have another agenda." Kwame didn't respond immediately. Amina grabbed the file and held it up. "Your mother, she was murdered and my father was involved." This time his expression changed. His eyes turned cold, razor sharp. Slowly he stepped toward her. Amina's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. "I didn't marry you for love," Kwame finally admitted, his voice low and controlled. "I married you because this was the only way for me to get what I wanted." A shiver ran down her spine. "And what is that?" Kwame remained silent. Amina clenched her fists. "I'm just a pawn in your game, aren't I?" Still, he didn't answer, but there was something terrifying in his eyes. Amina felt her chest tighten with fear. She had once thought she was simply a forced bride, but now she realized she was caught in the middle of a revenge plot, and she might never escape. The air in the room grew unbearably tense, suffocating in its intensity. Amina stared into Kwame's eyes, a storm of emotions raging inside her. Fear, anger, doubt. He had used her. This marriage wasn't just a business deal. It was a calculated move in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Yet Kwame remained unnervingly calm. He neither denied nor attempted to explain himself, and that silence was drowning her. She tightened her grip on the documents in her hand, her voice trembling with fury. "So you married me just to get revenge on my father?" Kwame tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes deepening like an endless abyss. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice low. His question felt like a slap to her pride. "I don't need to think anything. The truth is right here in these files." She lifted the stack of documents, her eyes burning with rage. "My father was involved in your mother's death, and you married me to get back at my family." Her breathing was uneven, her heartbeat erratic. She wanted him to deny it. She wanted him to prove her wrong. But Kwame just stood there, watching her. No excuses, no explanations. And that silence was his answer. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her lips, but there was no humor in it. "You're despicable," her voice trembled with barely contained emotions. "You used me as a pawn in your game, without even giving me the truth." Kwame inhaled deeply and took a step toward her, but Amina immediately stepped back, raising her hand like a barrier between them. "Don't come near me!" Her voice was sharp as a blade. Kwame froze for a fleeting second. Something flickered in his eyes. Hesitation. Amina shut up. She snapped. Kwame's eyes widened slightly. This was the first time she had yelled at him. Amina felt as if an uncontrollable fire was burning inside her.